We're in this series on David, and we really have just got started. We kind of had a week in there where we had our birthday, and so we took a little bit of a break. So we're kind of 2 stories into this book on David's life, and the youth group are going to talk about the story of David and Goliath next week, and so I'm kind of in between stories right now. If you've read any of 1 Samuel. Jim Bob's story last week about Saul and the evil spirit butts right up against David and Goliath. So we're going to be talking kind of in the middle of those 2 stories. I think it was really exciting studying for it. I didn't think I would have a lot to talk about, but it ends up being way more than I can cover just today. But I want to start off by talking about this weekend. It was a really cool weekend. First experience in my life of going to a Civil War reenactment. This picture was a picture that my little brother took. He was involved in it. Do we have the picture? Yeah, right there. He took that the morning of, so yesterday morning before the reenactment. And he and a bunch of guys dressed up in period garb. I think I have a picture of him all dressed up with me and some other brothers in the picture with him. But they faced off and then they reenacted this battle. And I thought it was really cool because we got there early enough to see these guys lined up and facing off at each other, the Union and the Confederate, and you could feel the tension building. For one, we were ready for the fight to get started because it was hot, but also just seeing these guys ready for battle and nothing happening, that tension just built and built and built. And then finally, whenever everything happened, even though we were there for a while, at the end it seemed like it all happened so quickly. And so that's kind of where we are in this book of 1 Samuel. We pick up in 1 Samuel. I wrote chapter 1. It's not chapter 1. It's chapter 17, verses 1 through 11. So that was a mistake in the slide. But chapters 17, verse 1 and 11 says, "The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Soko and Judah and Azekah at Ephes Dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them." So we had these 2 armies faced off on opposite sides of this valley, getting ready for war. And then it says, "Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield." So Goliath was a big dude, extremely intimidating. So intimidating that these armies are faced off not doing anything, just listening to Goliath talk. And so Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I'm the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. So this seemed like kind of the opening scene of a movie. We've got this kind of cut back and forth between these 2 armies that are getting ready to fight, and this one super massive guy who kind of steals the scene. And he has a lot to say. You kind of get the feeling that he likes the sound of his own voice. And so he taunts the Israelites daily. But I like to think, though, that whenever we read these passages in Scripture, what is this trying to tell us? Because it is definitely telling a story, but it's also telling us a little bit about God's plan of redemption for humanity. This is a small part of a huge narrative, and so God's painting a picture, and so we want to try to capture that. What is this scripture is saying to us today. And I think what we're going to do is take this little passage right here and then the history behind it, and we're going to compare two people. We're going to compare King Saul, the current king of Israel, with King David, the future king of Israel, and how they reacted to this situation, this man, Goliath, and see what we can discover about the actual miracle behind this story, David and Goliath. So whenever we're talking, kind of setting the stage for this, we need to remember the occasion of Saul being appointed as king. And Jim Bob talked a little bit about this in his first sermon, because he talked about the anointing of David, the fact that David was chosen because he was different than Saul. And we'll talk about that. But the story of Saul kind of picks up in 1 Samuel 8. We're told this is kind of written from the perspective of this prophet Samuel. And Samuel's getting old, and he has two sons, and his two sons were crooked. And it's raising concern in the Israelite people. They have an aged leader whose sons aren't going to be leaders like their dad. And this picks up in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba. But they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. Look, they told him, you are now old, and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. This is a huge turning point in the history of Israel. Because up to this point, the nation of Israel was a theocracy. They were being governed by God through some type of prophet or ambassador, and now they're wanting a king. And so this alarms Samuel because it is a big change. But ultimately, God had already laid out the rules in Deuteronomy for Israel's king and how that interaction was to happen, what kind of power he would have. So God requests that Samuel inform the people of what this is going to look like. We got government, we got taxes. You're going to have to give up some of your land, your sons and daughters, because now you have a king. And so Samuel in verse 19, that same chapter, says, but the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning. Even so, we still want a king, they said. We want to be like the nations around us. Our king will judge us and lead us into battle. And I think it's interesting right there, the Israelites' last statement. They want a king to lead them into battle, because the previous chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 7, is God acting through Samuel to conquer the Philistines at this place called Mizpah. That just happened. That's the previous chapter. And so the Israelites have quickly forgotten what God had done, which they're really good at. The Israelites seem to be fairly good at forgetting what God had just done. And so they had forgotten about this, and they want a man to lead them into battle. And that's important. Remember that, because it's going to come up again. The Israelites want a king because it will be a man to lead them into battle. A judge and a man to lead them into battle. And then the second reason that this will come up in the story of Goliath. And you guys will have to kind of wait a little while for that. So, at that moment, then we're introduced to this man. He's a prominent man of the tribe of Benjamin named Kish. And Kish had a son named Saul, and it tells us that Saul was handsome, Saul was tall, a head above everyone else. And in chapter 9, verse 2, it says that he was without equal in the Israelite people. That Saul was without equal. So we've got this tall, handsome man, right? Perfect politician material. Somebody that you can get behind. Somebody that can lead you into battle. But right after that, we get the idea that Saul might not be the brightest bulb in the box. So a stereotypical politician, maybe. The first time we're introduced to Saul, his father's herd of donkeys has gotten lost. And Saul can't find a herd of donkeys. With the help of a servant, for days. He can't. But even more than that is what happens at the end of Saul is ready to give up. He's ready to go home and be like, Dad, I'm sorry, couldn't find it. Better luck next time. And this servant reminds Saul that they are close to a town where a man named Samuel lives. And Samuel is a prophet. Leaving it in the hands of God, God narrows it down to the tribe of Benjamin, this man named Kish, and then his son Saul. And so they're ready to bring out Saul, crown him as king, but they can't find him. They don't know where he is. They finally end up finding him. You know where he is? He's hiding in the baggage. That's what it says. Hiding in the baggage. This giant of Israel is hiding in the luggage. And so they pull him out and they realize that he's magnificent, he's handsome and tall, and they're ready to make him leader, so they crown him. Then right after this, Saul is kind of, his position as leader is confirmed by God, and that he leads the Israelites against this man named Nahash, an Ammonite, who's attacking a city in Israel. And God, through Saul, leads the people into battle, and they completely conquer and vanquish this opponent. And then it goes downhill from there. That's about the pinnacle of Saul's kingdom, is that moment where God gets behind him and he wins his victory. Because after that, he does win, and God is obviously still with him. But Saul is not the best king. That's really what this story is about. And so Saul makes mistakes. Saul's greedy. Saul's impatient. Saul doesn't really care about Samuel's position as prophet. Saul thinks that God is maybe a tool to use to win battles. And then he also doesn't listen to God's commands. He's very selfish and keeps a lot of spoil for himself whenever he wins these battles. And so God decides that Saul is not going to be king anymore. And I think it's important, to realize that this is not God changing his mind. This is not God saying, oh, whoops, Saul wasn't who I thought he was. Saul was the king that the Israelites wanted, and he was the king that the Israelites deserved. But he was not the king that God intended. And so the Israelites got to experience this time with Saul as a reigning king. And so it comes to a head right after this one battle where Saul keeps a bunch of spoil, and Samuel confronts him about it. And we pick up in chapter 13. How foolish, Samuel exclaimed. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. God rejects Saul because Saul's not a man after God's own heart. He chooses someone else over Saul. And so Jim Bob talked last week about the turmoil that this creates. And immediately after this, it talks about God removing his spirit from Saul. And so Saul is tormented by this evil spirit that of all people, David is placed into a position to help with. And Saul falls so much in love with this little boy that he makes him his armor bearer, one of his armor bearers, which is some crazy irony there, that the current king of Israel is being protected by the future king of Israel. And that'll come up a lot. That this man king is being served and protected by this boy king. So we also have the passage that Jim Bob talked about the very first week where David's anointed. And the story along that, I think it's important to highlight those details that God sends Samuel to anoint Jesse's son. That's what he's told, this man Jesse's son. And when he gets there, it just makes sense that they would anoint the oldest, Eliab. And it's because, and Samuel thinks of this, Samuel says, look at how this guy stands out. he's even tall. Like, isn't that the problem we just had, Samuel? Have you forgotten already? And so we have this picture of God picking the runt of the litter because he doesn't look on the outside, he looks on the inside. And so we have this little boy. And now this is the point in the story where we finally comes full circle. We're back at that battle scene that started this whole lesson off. And it gets a little confusing. I don't know if you guys have started reading 2 Samuel. I know Jim Bob kind of encouraged you to, because we're leaving out a lot of history, and I just kind of skimmed over a lot of it. But if you're reading through 2 Samuel, the chronology gets a little complicated between chapters 16 and 17. And there's a lot of different reasons why. I think the biggest reason is we're making a transition from Saul's story to David's story. So the last two things we talked about, the anointing of David and the removal of God's Spirit, that is the end of Saul's story with David as a character. And now we're picking up the story of David where Saul is playing a character. And so what we see is that David is with his dad. His three older brothers are in the army fighting for Saul, and he's Saul's armor bearer, but he travels back and forth. He spends a lot of time taking care of his father's flock, being that shepherd boy that he's famous for before he becomes king. And his dad sends him off with some food for his brothers and his brothers' commanding officers, and he wants David to bring back word from the battle and a token. And there's a lot of meaning behind this and I want you guys to keep this in mind for next week, but that David's dad wants a token, some kind of spoil of warfare, something from the battle to show that the Israelites are fighting and possibly winning this battle. So David's going to bring back word and this token. And so David leaves his father's house and he gets to the battle, and he gets there to go and find his brothers just before Goliath comes out, because Goliath's coming out every day to taunt the Israelites, kind of demean them and crush their spirits. And so David hears this taunt from Goliath, him speaking poorly of not only the Israelites, but the God of the Israelites specifically. And he also overhears the soldiers recalling what Saul, this giant of a king, right, the Israelites giant, Saul has offered a reward for the man who will lead this battle, who will go and face Goliath and defeat him. And the reward will come up later, but the reward was wealth, immense wealth. Saul's daughter's hand in marriage. Spoiler alert, that's not a reward. That'll come up later. And also that his family will be exempt from taxes, which is a pretty big deal. I don't know if you guys just enjoy that time of year, but it would be awesome to just not have to worry about that anymore. And so I think it's interesting the way that this hits David, and David's response is extremely appropriate. And it's chapter 17, verse 26. David asked the soldier standing by, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending this defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" Little shepherd boy David is like, who does this guy think he is that he can come out here and say that stuff about my God? That was David's reaction. Whereas Saul would be super happy if someone would just offer to fight Goliath. I'll pay him whatever, but somebody needs to fight this guy. David's response is, why hasn't somebody taken care of this already? This pagan Philistine. Now, most translations say this uncircumcised Philistine. He is not chosen by God. So why are we sitting out here listening to this? I think his response is extremely appropriate too, because considering his age, this could possibly be the first time he has ever heard anyone blaspheme God. Like, is he just completely taken aback? Like, how in the world are we even allowing this? And so he starts to circulate around and be asking these questions. Who's going to take care of this? Are you going to take care of it? Are we going to find somebody to go ahead and end this because it should already be over? And his older brother overhears him and stops him. And he accuses him of making these statements and coming to the battle to watch, to get a token and then to run off home. Maybe even with a little hint of jealousy, because his little brother had been chosen king of Israel. He knew that. But he really accuses David of just coming around to just be a spectator. And David says, oh no, that's not why I'm here. And he continues to make these statements, and it comes to the attention of Saul, and Saul makes a meeting with David. And this is what David says to Saul. This is what shepherd boy David says to giant King Saul. Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. He said, when a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and I club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. I think it's important to point out, I'm just going to skim over this, that David doesn't say that time that a lion attacked the sheep and then that other time that a bear. He uses plural both times. So this is like a regular occurrence, I guess, for shepherds. This Philistine making these accusations is the same noise as would come from a roaring lion or bear, or a growling bear. There's nothing behind it, right? It's just an intimidation. Because David's experienced something way more powerful than that. Right? He sits out in the field alone tending these sheep, and he experiences God in a way that Saul obviously hadn't. So, what do we get from this? Saul accuses. I keep making that mistake. Saul accuses this little boy of being less than a warrior. David hadn't fought against any giants. So what does David mean by saying that he'll take care of this? It's interesting, though, that, do you guys remember why the Israelites wanted a king? To judge them. And who is Saul to judge? He's already made enough mistakes to lose his position. And to lead them into battle, which he's also failing at. The two things that the Israelites said they wanted a king for. I think it's also interesting, too, that when you look back, you see that God wanted his king to be a shepherd. That was the plan of God all along. He wanted a king to have that occupation before he became a king. Saul wasn't good at tending donkeys. So he couldn't make a good king, right? And we see this even as far back as Moses. Moses spent time being a shepherd before God sent him into Egypt to free the Israelites. And so who would have thought that David's early years sitting in that field with those sheep were divinely ordained so that the experience that he had would prepare him for this awesome task that he's about to take part in. And not just with Goliath, but leading a nation. Consider the hand of God on David's life. God ordained that David would be the last of 8 sons to be born to Jesse. He ordained that so that he would be given this menial task of watching over the small flock of sheep that Jesse owned. God divinely guided Samuel to anoint David so that David would have the Spirit of God on him to kill these bears and lions and Goliath. God gave David hours of solitude so that he could meditate on God, so he could remember what God had done with the Israelites and to the Israelites and for the Israelites. And that he could develop this heart of worship that Jim Bob talked about last week, this ability to play music, to soothe and calm other people. That was a divine appointment. David also, because of those skills that he had, was brought into close proximity to Saul so that he could learn how to rule. Saul was made king as an adult, so all of his credentials had to be based on what had happened already. David was made king as a boy and grew into that position, prepared by God. And this isn't just David years ago. As a Christian, God has a purpose and a calling for your life. Did you guys know that? Were you aware of that? We've been talking about that a lot in youth group. What is our mission as Christians? So you should, and the providence of God has allowed that you have a mission in your life, and God started fashioning you in your mother's womb, preparing you for this mission. And He's placed these experiences in your life to shape you into the adult that He wants you to be. And no doubt these experiences had a big part in my life, and you can look back and you can say, well, this was a good experience and this was a bad experience, but you can see how God is weaving them all together to make you into the person that you are today. But the coolest thing is that in learning to be a faithful shepherd, David didn't only learn to lead the nation of Israel. David became a prototype, a picture, a foreshadowing of what Jesus would be, the Good Shepherd. And we don't know exactly when David came to faith in this God of Israel, right? We don't know exactly when it took place, but we know that his relationship with God grew from an early stage. And he was a man after God's own heart, not because of the things that David had done, but because of the man that God was making him into. David's relationship with God begins by realizing, embracing that God is a shepherd. We see that in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. You guys familiar with that psalm? So David sees God in this relationship as a sheep and a shepherd, and God is watching over and protecting David, just like David protects his sheep. And then David's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson comes to earth to be the Good Shepherd. Jesus says in John 10, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Thousands of years later, we get this little king who was anointed at a young age to grow into the man that God had destined him to be. The Good Shepherd. So as we move forward and we look at David, we need to keep that in mind. So next week, whenever we talk about this battle between David and Goliath, because we haven't got there yet. Some of you guys might know the story already. I want to kind of present to you today that maybe the biggest miracle in this story of David and Goliath has already happened. That God would take an active role in David's life to prepare him to be the man that God needed. It wasn't just coincidence that David was a shepherd. It wasn't just coincidence that David faced those beasts, the lion and the bear. It wasn't coincidence that he was put within the circles of Saul. It wasn't just coincidence. Sometimes the miracle is in the preparation. And we miss it because we're looking for God's hand in the end. God's leadership development program is one that begins very early in your life. And it's not accomplished in the classroom through formal programs. Even though those are helpful, God's leadership development program, it takes place in the school of life. God puts us in difficult and challenging situations to deepen our trust in Him, to realize the things that He's done, to reminisce and remember the part that He's taken in our life. And that's what the youth group we're going to get up here and do next week. I honestly cannot wait for these kids to come up here and talk about giants they've faced and the deliverance that God has provided. Because honestly, I think that's what church should be about. It should be telling the stories of what God is doing in our life. Taking us from depravity, taking us as lost sheep, and making us into the people that He desires us to be. So, I'm going to end the service with a little bit of a cliffhanger. We don't know if David wins or not. You'll have to come back next week and find out. But I do want to encourage you guys this week to go out and realize that we serve an infinitely powerful, all-knowing God who has a mission and a plan for you. He's inviting you to be a part of it. And quite possibly, the hardships that are happening in your life right now are molding you towards perfection, towards glory, towards being that image of Christ. So think about that this week. Let's pray.